Hello again. I'm Jonathan Barker, and this is part 2 of the video blog, A Disruption That Just May Save Us. The disruption is to know the prior U.S. history which partly motivated the attempted insurrection of the United States government at the Capitol on January 6th of this year, 2021. This is a history dating back to 1493 and the Doctrine of Discovery, also known as the Discovery Doctrine, issued by the Roman Catholic Church. I explained this doctrine throughout Part 1. The doctrine promoted a racist residue of injustices continuing today to the steps of the U.S. Capitol. That doctrine has influenced U.S. laws, economy, social-cultural norms, and spirituality, which continue to fuel the white supremacy movement here and in Europe before, during, and after the colonization of this country. I doubt the white supremacists today who stormed the Capitol on January 6th knew anything specific about the Discovery Doctrine. Perhaps they had never heard of it. Yet the essence of that doctrine descended to those men and women today through multiple generations of their ancestors, infecting them with the belief that the U.S. rightly belongs to them. As such, they were simply at the Capitol January 6, 2021, to assert their rights, which emanated from the Discovery Doctrine. Knowing the true history of how this country and others were settled amidst racial, social, economic, and spiritual injustice is the disruptive corrective that's needed today. Our history divided us then as it divides us now. Many continue to deny this history, which is to deny the reality of its toxic results. Knowing and respecting our history holds a promise to unite us. This is the disruption that may save us. We begin with those who built and maintained the spiritual structures of power and division within this country, the white church. Regarding the predominantly white evangelical church, much of it remains complicit today by its silence. Mainline white churches read books, educate themselves, pass resolutions, and feel guilt about white injustices against the indigenous people upon whose lands we all live, and against the African blacks who were taken from their homelands, brought to the United States on slave ships to be bought and sold, to build and enrich their white owners' properties. This country has been living with the divisions and suffering caused by the Discovery Doctrine for almost 2.5 centuries. Fortunately, some truth and light has emerged about the doctrine and is being shared by the United Nations, the World Council of Churches, and some denominations in the United States, which all repudiate the doctrine of discovery. In 2018, the Presbyterian Church USA joined other white mainline denominations primarily in concluding, quote, "Moreover, because the doctrine of discovery has been a central part of U.S. law regarding the tribal lands and slavery, the Presbyterian Church has played a major role historically in the implementation of the doctrine," unquote. The Church's prior ignorance and silence regarding racial injustice has long been sustained by allowing the Discovery Doctrine and its false theology to remain standing. Jesus was recorded to have said, "Make disciples of all nations," yes, That is not in dispute. How that goal was to be achieved is the issue. All the images of Jesus in white churches depict him as a glowing, white-skinned man of European descent. How then can white church members speak against a white Christ they have created in their own image? How could they criticize their own white brothers and sisters today also, who attack the U.S. Capitol boldly demanding what they believe is rightfully theirs? It's easier to deny we have any affiliation with white supremacy when we are unaware of our own history and complicity in white supremacy stemming from the Discovery Doctrine. It was the Apostle Peter, Jesus' own disciple, who made a similar denial that he knew Jesus just before Jesus was killed. Today we say we have no understanding of white supremacy and no part in its acts of division and hatred. We'll continue believing this until we learn the true historical corrective. That history will disrupt our past thinking based on what we were taught as children. We have grown complicit by ignorance. We have supported injustices legalized since the birth of this nation. Jesus did tell his disciples that when he left them, they were to make disciples of all nations. We look at the model Jesus employed to call and teach his own disciples. That model included grace, mercy, peace, love, kindness, hospitality, and justice. These same attributes were intended to be used by his future disciples when inviting those in other nations to join the faith. The means authorized by the church's doctrine of discovery were the antithesis of Jesus' method or wishes. Never intended by Jesus was the making of disciples by force, by land seizures, by the subjugation of indigenous people, or by the brutalities of slavery. Nevertheless, all these were justified by Pope Alexander VI, head of the sacred and secular aspects of life, and his predecessors. Most in the church today, like the insurrectionists who stormed the U.S. Capitol January 6th of 2021, and white supremacists around the world, may have never heard of the doctrine of discovery. Nonetheless, its theologically unjust principles have trickled down through the generations, infecting the thinking, the theology, and the legal activity of this country and other colonized lands, like a virus from 1493, a virus which may have done more damage than all the biological viruses and cancers since the doctrine was unleashed. So embedded is the discovery doctrine in the United States that many churches and the state have been unable to extricate that doctrine's theocratic influences from the theological or the social and legal fabric of this nation. Even such heady documents as the Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution have failed to identify and erase the blemish of this doctrine. Neither noble or inspiring words, nor the bloody actions of the Revolutionary War, the Civil War, nor even the Supreme Court decisions denying indigenous land ownership, nor civil rights or voter rights legislation have been able to remove the stain of this doctrine of injustice from U.S. laws, church theology, and the social order. Since the doctrine, some civil rights laws and events have attempted to disrupt the church and the state from this doctrine's evil results. Yet it has been deeply embedded, so much so, into the DNA of both the church and the state. It's been impossible to remove. The theology of this country and its laws have been tarnished by it. Its continuing damage has become ubiquitous and even unconscious to lawmakers and theologians alike. How can its damage be undone? How can reparations ever be made to those who were harmed, when only a few theologians and lawmakers understand or accept any complicity or responsibility for the doctrine's continuing legacy? The establishment of this country's legal system was built upon an embedded theological lie, rather than being built upon the truth that Christ Jesus, the Prince of Peace, intended the church to make disciples of all nations through love, peace, and hospitality. The church and the state colluded instead to fulfill the belief in manifest destiny. Manifest destiny, a natural offshoot of the doctrine of discovery. Misled by the lily-white Christ idol created by European church theology, it was believed that God, through the white church of Jesus Christ, had ordained the full colonization and settlement of the United States from ocean to ocean, shore to shore, by white explorers. Essential to the practice of seizing indigenous lands was the legal decision made by the highest U.S. court to the practice of seizing indigenous lands, that indigenous people had a right to occupy the land, to use it, but not to own it. Manifest destiny was the fulfillment of the doctrine. What God had given the white European explorers, conquerors, settlers, our ancestors. In reality, what it was and is the racially biased theft of indigenous lands and communities by white settlers, backed by the U.S. government law. This law is based upon the doctrine of discovery, one of the most pernicious, disruptive events in the history of the U.S. and the world. Today, I see but one disruptive event needed to positively counteract the dangerous course of the U.S. democracy from progressing further into the treacherous waters of an autocratic government led by white supremacist pseudo-Christians today. The positive, disruptive event which might save us is to learn our history and acknowledge the truth of our ancestors' adoption of the discovery doctrine and how that has affected the world since. Even unwittingly, that history left a trail of injustice since the founding of this country. This is to understand our historical truth. The theological errors within the doctrine of discovery poisoned our heritage. It hid Christ's truth behind greed and injustice and brought us to this dangerous point. Several churches have acknowledged their complicity in the doctrine's theological lie. The Congress and the general public both need to learn how this history has shaped and continues to shape and undermine the ideals of what could be the true greatness of the American experiment in democracy. It will not surface unless our true and complete history corrects the half-truths which continue to be taught generation after generation to children who become parents, and then who become women and men who have been elected to serve all the people in both houses of the U.S. Congress. The disruptive event which may save this country can correct the mistaken vision of this country as the savior of the world. And that self-glorifying vision continues despite how our misguided theology continues to skew and infect the way we think, believe, and act toward people of color, immigrants, the poor, and the prejudice felt toward those who are unlike us, the white, the privileged, those in power, especially if we are descendants of the white European founders of this nation, or white immigrants thereafter. This country needs to be disrupted by the truth of our history. So the words of a slave-holding founder of this country who penned the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson, can be realized. Quote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all people are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these rights are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." Those flowery words that Jefferson penned belie the facts, the truth, that Jefferson never freed the many slaves that he owned. Learning our historical, theological truth is the disruptive event needed for the morality of the United States to catch up to the technology of the United States. The founders of this country affirmed a separation of church and state in the Constitution, yet their theology was already so tainted by the Discovery Doctrine, they unknowingly, unconsciously possessed a serious blind spot. They were unable to realize they were the beneficiaries of the flawed doctrine, which had brought together church and state. The church provided the theological justification for the actions of the state. As such, the founders owned land taken from the indigenous people. They were well educated. They were wealthy. They owned black slaves, who made them even wealthier, more powerful leaders and lawmakers to their own personal benefit. Not so different from today. That benefit transferred from white generation to the next. The near insurrection of the U.S. government, January 6th of this year, causes citizens of this country and leaders of this government who did not participate to wonder how this could happen. Many point their fingers. Are we not, however, better served to look in the mirror? Are we not complicit by our ignorance, by our failure to know the true history of our country, and the influence of a theological lie, choosing instead a version of history which has supported and sustained our lifestyles for generations? What motivates needed change of the status quo at any time but a disruptive event which cannot be brushed aside? We can brush aside the driving influences of our history only so long. It caught up with us in a dramatic way on the steps of the United States Capitol January 6th. The insurrectionists were motivated by a political lie. The Doctrine of Discovery perpetuated a much greater theological lie, upon which hangs a much pain and injustice. Jesus never acted in such a way as promoted by the false doctrine of discovery. Why? Because love always trumps greed. Thank you for listening.